Now, I want to warn you that Sherwin Wine would never have begun his presentation at a colloquium in the following way. I received an email this week It was the third time I had received the same email over the past few months. The email began, "Recently this week, the United Kingdom removed the Holocaust from its school curriculum because it offended the Muslim population, which claims that it never occurred." Now, receiving this for the third time was frustrating because I knew every time that it was not true. It was not true because I found the real story. There's a marvelous place to go. It's called snopes.com. It investigates these email things, and so before you send it out to 75 of your friends, check first. Because when you go to this site and you read about this story, it turns out that there was one history class in one school in the United Kingdom that avoided the topic for that reason. And there was another class in a totally separate school that avoided the Crusades for a similar reason. But for some reason, Jews are not emailing about the Crusades not being taught in their classes. What happened was a newspaper reporter wrote an inflammatory headline saying, "Schools avoiding controversial topics," and someone read the headline and not the article, or read the first paragraph and not the whole article, and they wrote up this email and sent it out, and it was sent out and sent out and sent out, but it's not true. So if you ever receive this email, I want you to write back to the person who sent it to you and say it's not true. And you have to write back everyone that you sent it to and back to the person who sent it to you, because truth has to go backwards through the chain. It teaches us one more time that the internet is a source of information but not a source of truth. There's plenty of information that's wrong, but we believe it. Why do we believe this email? Why is it going around so often that I've gotten it 3 times, even though every time I send it back and say it's not true? We have this story locally. You may remember after September 11th, the story went around that a local restaurant had caught its workers dancing in joy at the destruction of the Twin Towers on September 11th. And soon after, every Middle Eastern restaurant in town, which is quite a few of them, put up American flags in the window. It didn't help this particular restaurant. It's changed managements now 3 times. But the suspicion is there, because in many ways, fear is the intersection of knowledge and ignorance. You know some things, but not everything. My grandparents were born in Aleppo, in Syria, and they moved to Brooklyn. You may have read about them in the New York Times recently. But they were very familiar with Arab life. They spoke Arabic at home. They understood Arabic culture. They did business with Arabic-speaking neighbors and Muslim neighbors. For them, Hamish of food wasn't kugel. It was kibbeh and ijeh and jedra. I mean, that for them was home cooking. Now, for these thousands and even millions of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, they lived in the Muslim world. They were very familiar with it. And to a great extent, it was familiar with them. Today, in the world, there are more Jews in Germany than there are in the Muslim world. Now, without this living experience of Jews in the Muslim world, and without the Muslim world's living experience of Jews in sizable and visible communities, this hostility has only grown with distance. And if our topic this weekend were Jews in the Muslim world, we would be done on Saturday morning. But this is not the problem of Jews in the Muslim world. It's Jews and the Muslim world. Jews confronting the Muslim world and interacting with the Muslim world and trying to solve the puzzle. That topic has never been more timely, and one weekend is barely enough to contain it. Now, we believe these false emails and these rumors because, unfortunately, sometimes the truth isn't that much more pleasant. 1,000 years ago, it was largely true that it was better to be a Jew under a Muslim ruler than to be a Jew under a Christian ruler. But today, I am much happier as a humanistic Jew in this allegedly Christian nation than I am as either a humanist or a Jew in the Muslim world. The president of Iran did deny that the Holocaust happened, and he threatened to wipe out the state of Israel. And after September 11th, a rumor did sweep the Muslim world, both by email and also through mainstream media outlets, that the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, was behind the attacks, and that 4,000 Jews who were in on the conspiracy stayed home from work. And it was proven by security cameras. No matter whatever the proposed peace parley in November produces, we know that in the Hamas Charter and in many other groups, they have sworn to resist until there is no Israel, or until every Jew in the region lives, as they say, under the banner of Islam. But you see, the whole truth is more than just today's anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. There's more. After all, it wasn't eternal. It's not intrinsic to Islam in every time and in every place. We've seen successes, and we'll hear about successes of Jewish life in times and in many places in the Muslim world. In the 19th century, Jewish support for European colonies in North Africa and the Middle East as they joined the Alliance Israelite schools and became part of the colonial apparatus, that didn't endear them to their Muslim neighbors. And Zionism, for all of its marvelous successes and inspiring achievements that we celebrate, it built a Jewish state in a land ruled and peopled largely by Muslims, not exclusively. There were Jews there all the time, but it was largely populated and ruled by Muslims for 1,000 years. And the state of Israel itself, in its zealous and appropriate defense of its citizens, has also killed and created enemies. Now, no matter what Ahmadinejad says, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Israel is a reality. It will be a reality. And if previous Muslim tolerance of Jews was based on Muslim power and Jewish weakness, then we have to find something new. But also, if the breaks between the West and the Muslim world are wider and deeper than just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if the issues are older than Zionism and more deeply rooted even in the state of Israel, then we need to look beyond the simple answers and even the simple solutions. Secular humanistic Judaism wants the whole truth. We can handle the truth about ourselves and the truth about the world that we live in. That's what the colloquium is all about. It's about facing the pressing issues of the day with our reasoning minds and our caring hearts. At the colloquium, we have studied the unaffiliated Jew, we have reclaimed Jewish history, we have gone beyond tradition to seek a new Jewish identity, we've explored secular spirituality, we've delved into the love-hate relationship between Jews and non-Jews, and even gone digging for the truth through archaeology and the Bible. We've been educated, we've been inspired, but more important, we've left with a sense of what the past and present mean for today, here and now. And today, here and now, there is no more pressing issue than Jews and the Muslim world. Just look at what we're going to cover in the next 2 days in Colloquium 07. Those of you who have a book because you signed up for the colloquium can see the lineup, and those who haven't can still sign up. Let me tell you the lineup. Beginning tomorrow morning, we have Jacob Lassner, a professor formerly of Wayne State University, known to many in the room from that connection, but now in Northwestern, outside of Chicago, my kind of town. And he is an expert on the early history of the Muslim world, and he will open for us a window onto the primary sources that set the tone for Jewish-Muslim relations. Immediately following, we have Jane Gerber, an expert in Sephardic Judaism of all periods, professor at the Graduate Center for the City University of New York and director of their Institute for Sephardic Studies. And she will give us the Jewish side of the story in that first millennium of Jewish-Muslim relations. In the afternoon, we turn to the more modern period, and we have Derek Pensler, welcome back to our colloquium from previous participation, where he is a professor at the University of Toronto and the director of their program of Jewish Studies. And he will explore this core issue of Zionism and the Muslim world, both how the Muslim world has responded to Zionism and how Zionism has responded to Islam. And then we turn to Yehuda Bauer, who for many in this audience needs no connection and introduction. He has graced this bima many times with his eloquence and his brilliance. He's one of the world's foremost experts on anti-Semitism, and he will give us the truth as he knows it about anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. And he will also offer his perspectives on what to be done on the Jewish side of the ledger on Sunday morning. And finally, Amir Hussain from Loyola Marymount University, a Pakistani-born Muslim and Toronto-raised. He is now a professor in California, and his perspective on what can be done, the Muslim response on Sunday morning, is not to be missed. Of course, as we have at all colloquia, it is not only the speaker presenting, but the panel responding that provides the meaning. In fact, we will all have opportunities to join in the conversation As the audience will be able to submit written questions, they will become part of the dialogue on the stage, and the discussions will be facilitated by the leaders in our movement, rabbis ordained and educated through the International Institute. In fact, we will be ordaining several more leaders in our movement on Saturday evening, and I want to remind you that that event is open to the public and anyone may come. And if you hadn't signed up for colloquium, by Saturday night you can still sign up for Sunday morning. But our colloquium begins with our keynote speaker. He's the dessert, but well worth waiting for. I've left him for last, but certainly never for least. A year ago in the summer, in 2006, this conflict exploded in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. And in all of the media coverage that I saw, there was one voice that stood out. It was sometimes crackly over the phone. There often wasn't an active picture there because there was no way to provide a camera. But it was a voice that was brilliant and sensitive and articulate, understanding both sides of the issue, but coming from his own heart and describing what he was seeing and experiencing. And when I heard that Fawaz Gerges was coming to our colloquium, I was very excited. And that was when I was going to be sitting in the audience and not sharing the stage with him. Professor Gerges is a senior analyst and regular commentator at both ABC News and National Public Radio. He has graduate degrees from the London School of Economics and from Oxford University, and he is currently a professor at Sir Lawrence College. Now, Fawaz was born in Lebanon to a Christian family that lived surrounded by Muslim neighbors and friends. And he and his family lived through much of the terrible Lebanese civil war that ultimately claimed his brother's life as his brother was serving in the army. So he has experienced this firsthand. He has used his personal experience and his personal courage and his expertise and his brilliance to explore the fissures and the fractures in the Muslim world. He has explored Muslim extremism and the responses against it, and the world that has created for those living in the Muslim world today. Now, we see the barest glimpses of this in the news between Shia and Sunni. Now, our special treat is that Fawaz Gerges has just returned from 18 months traveling through the Muslim world. He has served as a Carnegie Scholar. He's previously received a MacArthur Fellowship. And he's going to give us the setting for our colloquium this weekend, a picture of the Muslim world at the dawn of the 21st century. And more importantly, the issues that we as Americans, we as Jews, we as citizens of the Western world will face. It is my pleasure to welcome to this podium and to open our colloquium as our keynote speaker, Fawaz Gerges.
And honored to be here. I could have really spent all evening just listening to the great voices, and I'm very grateful to Sharon for the invitation to come here and share in this moment of celebration, sadness and celebration. I think my misfortune is that I have not had the fortune to have met Sherwin, even though I hear him through your voices and through my conversations with some of you tonight. As Adam said, Sherwin and I, and then Adam and I, we talked about the format of tonight's talk. And I think since I have just returned from more than a year field research in the region, we thought that it would be wonderful to give you a glance of what's happening within the region itself. Because even though I was based in Cairo, Egypt, I traveled widely throughout the region. I started in Lebanon, of course, in June and July, when the war came to between Hezbollah and Lebanon and Israel. And then I moved to Egypt, Yemen, Algeria, Palestinian territories, Jordan, Syria, and the rest of the Middle East. And I think I really feel quite saddened myself by what I'm going to say tonight, because I don't think I have any good news to tell you. I wish I had had some positive views to say during this moment of celebration tonight. And I think, as Professor Malkin suggested, I mean, it's wonderful to talk about the historical civilizational moment, to talk about philosophy and reflect on the philosophical contributions of both Jews and Muslims, great minds. But when we talk about the present, it's a very unpleasant narrative. It's a very unpleasant narrative because unpleasant politics, unpleasant realities, bloody dictators that have really sapped the energy and bled the societies dry. And I think we would be making a terrible mistake if we think that somehow there is just war in Iraq or that just war between the Palestinians and the Israelis. This is the narrative now, and of course there is bloody, raging war between, inside Iraq and between Palestinians and Israelis. But I would like you to know that the entire region is boiling. It's not just Iraq, not just this particular skirmishes between the Palestinians and Israelis. I think, there are some major social and economic and political tensions that are shaking the very foundation of Arab and Muslim politics, whether it is in Egypt, or whether it's in Syria, or whether it's in Jordan, or whether it's in Saudi Arabia, or Sudan, or Libya. The entire region itself is engulfed in social and political conflict. And I know in the United States here we tend to focus a great deal on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict because I know most of us feel very deeply involved and attached to that particular theater of conflict. And of course now we find ourselves, the United States, in the heart of the world of Islam, that's Iraq, in the shifting sands of Iraq. But I really would like you to know that there are so many internal fault lines within the Muslim world that they are as important as the fault lines between the world of Islam and the Western world. In fact, I would argue that instead of focusing on the so-called the clash of civilization, as the focus has been in the last few years, we should really focus on the clash within civilization. And what I would like to do today is just, I know I'm going to basically simplify a great deal. I don't have plenty of time, so I want to keep it to about 30 minutes. But I just want to give you a glimpse of the internal fault lines that are shaking the regional order to its very foundation. I want to start with the first fault line. And you'll be surprised why I focus on what I call the widening and deepening socio-economic fault lines in the Muslim world today. This particular, what I call the social and economic and political divide in the Muslim world is real and serious. You have a very tiny elite, a very tiny, small elite of Arabs and Muslims who basically control the overwhelming majority, the bulk of resources in the region, and critical segments of Arab and Muslim populations who have no stake in this particular order. More than 40% of Arabs and Muslims today live either in poverty or below the poverty line. 42% of Egyptians, of the 75% Egyptians, live either in poverty or below poverty line on less than $2 a day. 62% of the 18 million Yemenis live below the poverty line. 69% of Sudanese live below poverty line. 40% of Lebanese, one of the most open societies, we used to boast about Lebanon, live below poverty line. This divide is real and is really shaking the very foundation of Arab and Muslim societies. You go to Cairo, I don't need to tell you about Cairo, one of the, most wonderful cities in the world. Surely Egypt is one of the oldest nation states in the world. You have 10 million people, what we call, the poverty belts surrounding Cairo. 10 million poor people who have nothing. 2 million Egyptians live in cemeteries. 2.5 million live basically on the roofs of buildings. This is Egypt, one of the oldest nation states in the world, the largest Arab state. You might say, so what? There is poverty, there is degradation. What's the big deal about that? I think the reason why some of us are deeply concerned about what I call the deepening and widening socio-economic divide in the Arab and Muslim world, because you have certain trends now which exacerbate this widening and deepening conflict in the region. Take, for example, what we call obsessive consumerism. You have 40% or 45% of the Egyptians who basically have less than $1 or $2 a day to survive on, yet every single Egyptian young man and woman basically feels the urge to have a cell phone. It's really serious, by the way. I mean, it is a cell phone. It's a sign of status, a sign of basically belonging, being part of the community. So you have, on the one hand, this, deepening and widening socioeconomic divide that's basically shaking Arab and Muslim societies, and at the same time you have obsessive consumerism. I was told in my interviews in Egypt that some young men and women basically hold plastic mobile telephones, basically because they really want to basically have the status, they want to belong, they want to say that we're part of the system. And the question is, how do you satisfy those rising expectations in a society, dismal economic performance? We can talk about the political questions. Not only you have obsessive consumerism and dismal economic and social performance, you have also what I call the social function of the Arab and Muslim states are deteriorating to the point what I call now is that, basically you have failed Arab states. If the oldest nation state in the world, if the largest Arab states in the world, Egypt, cannot really satisfy the needs of its population, the Egyptian state itself cannot deliver the goods anymore. So you have a widening and deepening socioeconomic divide, you have obsessive consumerism, and the state itself no longer can deliver the goods, and then now you have a compounded problem. And finally, you have what we call the new media and the new revolution. 15 years ago, Arab states used to control the flow of information to their population. But now, we know that Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and LBC and all those satellite television stations have broken the government's monopoly on the flow of information. And now, the poorest of the poor in Egypt, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Libya, everywhere, know exactly, the decadence that's taken place within their own elite, and basically they realize their predicament itself, and here you have the making of a major and social urban upheaval, if not a social revolution. And what alarms me the most is that, in fact, anything, and I know basically, as you know, the consensus within our foreign policy establishment in the United States is that, the Arab state, the Muslim state, has tremendous coercive capacity. Not to worry. The Arab state basically has the ability to suppress its population. Remember what happened in Iran in the late 1970s. Of course, we were caught napping in the late 1970s. We know on 9/11, of course, we were caught napping. In fact, I would not be surprised, and I hope I am wrong, and I pray that I am wrong, that to wake up one day and see major Arab cities and capitals on fire. Really, it takes, by the way, a protest over bread in Egypt or Jordan or Sudan. It takes a soccer game or basically a police atrocities to wake up one day and see the entire major posh areas in Cairo on fire, in Yemen and other places. And I don't think we should be surprised at all if such a thing was to happen in the region, given the basically widening and deepening socioeconomic divide and the new trends that basically the governments can no longer control. The second related fault line that I find in the region is that not only you have a deepening and widening socioeconomic divide, you also have what I call a vacuum of legitimate political authority. And again, I don't need to remind you that there are no few Democrats in our part of the world there. In fact, the vacuum of legitimate political authority has never been as big as it is today. And the reason why I'm stressing this vacuum of legitimate authority, because again, the state can no longer deliver the goods to its population, And at the same time, you have dictators that have been in power for ages. I mean, look at, again, I use Egypt as a model. Egypt, again, as the largest Arab state. Egypt is basically the cultural production in the Arab world comes from Egypt. Anything that happens in Egypt migrates to the rest of the Arab world. Mubarak has been in power for 26 years. 26 years since 1981, and Mubarak now is grooming his own son, Gamal, to succeed in the next 1 or 2 years. So here you have a widening, legitimate authority and vacuum of authority, coupled with the fact, I mean, it's one thing for Mubarak to be able to deliver the goods, but Mubarak can no longer deliver the goods. And that's why what you have in Egypt now and other countries is the making of either a social revolution, which I don't think is going to happen in the next few years, given the political realities, but the making of urban riots on huge scales if the situation, deteriorates further. And you might wonder sometimes, as you know, we keep talking about the rise of political Islam, the rise of Islamists. I don't see why I was surprised that the dominant social and political forces in the region tend to be, political Islamists. What I would like you to know is that political Islamists are popular not because somehow they have an attractive ideology. Yes, the ideology of political Islam is gaining traction in the Arab and Muslim world. Political Islamists are powerful because political Islamists are capable of delivering the goods. Political Islamists are being elected in various states because political Islamists are seen as an alternative to basically the corrupt and existing dictatorship in the region. And again, I don't need to tell you that in moments of duress, when people cannot basically provide bread and butter to their families at the end of the day, in moments of duress, people fall on the familiar. People fall on religion as one of the deepest values in societies. And the reason the question in the United States somehow there's something unique or irrational about Arabs and Muslims, migration to Islam. There's in fact nothing unique whatsoever about the popularity of political Islam. Muslims and Arabs in moments of duress, and this is truly, there is a crisis, an existential crisis in that part of the world. People are basically falling back on familiar constructs reassuring, familiar constructs that basically provide people with hope out of this, basically, that the embrace that has been in place for, in the last 50 or 60 years. The third fault line I want to focus on tonight, and again, I'm in terms of time, because I really would like to take some questions from the audience. I just want to basically not take much of your time, is what I call the, again, we keep talking about the clash of civilization between the world of Islam and the West. Again, what I see is that what I call this divide between Shia and Sunnis, that's again shaking the very foundation of the Middle East itself. And this particular, I'm not suggesting that the Sunni-Shia divide is ideological. It's a political divide. It's a recent divide. It's a divide about political authority, about resources. And what's happening now is that the reverberations of the Iraq War are being felt in almost every single country. In particular in the Gulf, in particular in Syria, in particular Lebanon. Again, my own country itself, Lebanon, stands on the brink of another major conflict. As a result, now the polarized situation between Sunni and Shiites. Again, I hope I am wrong, but the next war in Lebanon will not be between Christians and Muslims. The next war in Lebanon will be between Sunni and Shiites. And really, I have never seen the situation in Lebanon as polarized as it is today between the Shia camp and the Sunni camp. And again, please, I would like to qualify what I'm saying. This is not a religious divide. This is not an ideological divide. It's a political divide as a result of basically of the breakdown of the Iraq state itself, and also as a result of the unfolding struggle between the two communities in Iraq. You know, I'm really shocked. Even in non-sectarian states, in the Arab and Muslim worlds, this particular sectarian divide is migrating to some of the most non-sectarian societies in the Middle East, Yemen, Jordan, and Egypt. In my interviews, I do a great deal of interviews with activists, particularly mainstream Islamists and radical Islamists. Some radical Islamists are telling me now that the Shia in the Muslim world represents about 10% of the Muslim community. The Sunnis represent about 90%. Some radical religious activists are telling me that the Shia represents a more existential threat to Ahl Sunnah, the Sunni community, than the Americans. And I say, how could it be? How could it be that the Shia now represent a more existential threat to the Sunni community? And the answer is, well, surely the Americans can never infiltrate the social fabric of the world of Islam in the same way that the Shia do. Again, the idea of conspiracy that's basically taking hold is that the United States basically toppled the Sunni-dominated regime in Saddam Hussein and empowered the Shias in Iraq, and this is part of an American Zionist conspiracy. But this particular sectarian divide has, the potential, again, to devastate really and wreck the entire Middle Eastern system. And I don't need to tell you that the United States has played a pivotal role in basically pouring fuel on this particular divide. I know it was not intentionally done, but surely not only we toppled Saddam Hussein, not only we toppled, a military dictatorship, but the United States itself, the post-Saddam American regime in Iraq, basically destroyed Iraqi institutions. Look what the first steps that Paul Bremer did in Iraq to dissolve basically 400,000 strong military force that could have served basically to glue Iraq together. And of course, I don't need to tell you about what the United States has done since the toppling of Saddam Hussein. In many ways, American foreign policy, unwittingly and indirectly, has poured fuel on this particular divide, and this particular divide has the potential not only to destroy, regional stability, but even to harm American interests. Again, just to give you a glance of what I'm talking about here, not only you have, Sunnis and Iraqis now involved in an intense civil strife in Iraq, you have major Sunni and Shia communities in the Gulf. The Shia community, you have about 15% Shiites in Saudi Arabia, you have about 60% of Shiites in Bahrain, you have about 40% of Shiites in Kuwait, you have about 40-30% of Shiites in Lebanon, Syria you have about 15%, and this has the potential, in particular, if Iraq sinks into all-out conflict, to really, basically wreck the entire Middle Eastern order, and of course American vital interest, not to mention the vital interest of the international community. The fourth fault line I want to talk about is America's relations with the Muslim world. Again, I don't need to really tell you about how the United States is perceived in the Arab and Muslim world today. I don't want to go into the rhetoric of some of the interviews. I conducted about 400 interviews over the last 1 year and a half. I want you to know that there are no differences between conservative Arabs, conservative Muslims, liberal Muslims, and Islamists when it comes to the United States now. The United States is the same narrative exists about the United States really throughout the region. Even conservatives think of the United States, and the narrative is the following, and I'm simplifying. The United States basically is trying to subjugate Arabs and Muslims. The United States is waging a crusade against Islam and Muslims. The United States is not promoting democracy in Iraq. The United States is trying to basically control the Arab world and siphon its resources. What alarms me the most about this particular narrative, again, you might say, so what? So what if this particular narrative now predominates in the region? I think what the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq in particular has done is to radicalize and militarize mainstream public opinion as opposed to radical and militant Islamist public opinion. In the last 2 years, I have interviewed about 200 teens, Arab and Muslim teens, even some few Muslims in Europe itself. They're 14, 15 years old. Most of them are desperately trying to raise a few $100s to take a flight to the Syrian-Iraqi border to join the fight against the Americans. You know, truly I want you to know, if it was not for logistical reasons, and what I'm saying, I'm not saying anything original at all. Our intelligence services know about, of course, it's not part of the debate. If it was not for logistical reasons, if it was not for financial reasons, the flow of Arab and Muslim men to Iraq would exceed the flow of Arab and Muslim men to Afghanistan in the 1980s and 1990s. And you might say, well, I mean, the president keeps saying it's Al-Qaeda. But the overwhelming majority of those teens, the 14, 15 years old whom I'm interviewing, and other scholars, basically had nothing to do with either Islamist militancy or Al-Qaeda. I ask them, why are you trying to go to Iraq? I mean, and they say, you must be patronizing. You're asking us, why are we trying to go to Iraq? It's our religious duty to go to Iraq and try to liberate our homeland. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is that in the United States here, the dominant narrative, or at least till a particular period, the dominant narrative that somehow the United States was engaged in a project to promote and advance democracy throughout the Muslim world, and I'm really not exaggerating, and in fact I'm trying to, throughout the Muslim world, the American project in Iraq is seen as part of a crusade against Arabs and Muslims. The American project is seen as part of a campaign to basically subjugate Arabs and siphon their resources. And what this tells me, the reason why I'm hammering this particular theme is that Al-Qaeda's big ideological claims, remember what the ideological claims of Al-Qaeda since the 1997, 1998, is that the United States, basically, the head of the snake, is waging a crusade against Arabs and Muslims. Now, not only the French, Al-Qaeda is a French, not only the French in the Arab and Muslim world subscribe to this particular narrative, mainstream Arab and Muslim public opinion subscribe to this particular narrative. And that's why I put it to you that if it was not for financial and logistical reasons, I would say the flow that Iraq would become a major theater for both local jihad and global jihad against the United States than Afghanistan itself. Truly, the Iraq war has done a great deal of damage, not only to America's, status, not only to America's image, but also to civilization relations between Arabs and Muslims on the one hand and Westerners on the other. And unfortunately, again, I asked the question in the region, well, look what's happening in Iraq. Look at this particular sectarian crisis. I interview intelligent people. And the answer comes, well, look, Iraqis are not blowing themselves up. Iraqis are not exploding the suicide bombings. It's basically the American, the CIA, and the Mossad. This particular conspiracy that also dominate. I know you might find it extremely irrational. You might find it extremely, but I'm also puzzled by the fact that intelligent people subscribe to this particular narrative, this particular conspiratorial view, and it tells you, what this tells me, it tells you that the damage the Iraq war has done to relations between Arabs and Muslims on the one hand. Of course, this is nothing new, but what the Iraq war has done is to reinforce the previous perceptions about American hostility, Western hostility, and of course, Zionist hostility, because, Israel, as you know, I don't need to tell you, is seen as part of an extension of the Western alliance. And this brings me to the final fault line, what I call the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's really amazing again, and this is, of course, I'm not talking about any paradigm shift, but I am also amazed how the Palestinian-Israeli conflict now has been overshadowed by other fault lines that are shaking the Middle East to its very foundation. I find Muslims now talking more about the the Iraq war more than they're talking about the Palestinian war. The Sunni-dominated states in the Arab world, Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan are talking about the Shia arc of crisis. They're not talking about the Israeli threat. Iran now, I mean, you have a major struggle taking place between the Iranian-Syrian alliance on the one hand and the Sunni-dominated states on the other hand, along with the United States and Israel. And also, I think what's happening, again, I don't need to tell you that I think the Palestinians are witnessing the beginning of their first shots in the civil war. And that's why, I mean, the peace process we're talking about, it seems to me, even though I'm delighted that there are some moves on the part that the Bush administration is finally investing some capital in the peace process, I think there are very structural problems impeding any kind of a prospect for a breakthrough on a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and those impediments have to do, of course, with a weak leadership in Israel itself and a fragmented leadership in Palestine itself. I mean, you have now Hamas. I mean, there's a war taking place between Hamas and Fatah. Not to mention the fact that the Bush administration has 1 year or so, it does not really have adequate political capital to invest in a Palestinian-Israeli settlement. This does not mean that we don't have to struggle in order to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis to the negotiating table. This does not mean really that we don't really have to struggle in order to bridge the gap between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I want you to know that there is starvation in Gaza today. I mean, you have 1.5 million Palestinians who are on the brink of starvation. I have never seen the situation as desperate as it is in Gaza today. And I know, I mean, the dominant narrative about Hamas, I know the Palestinians deserve better, but I want you to know that Hamas is not a monolith. In the same way that the Palestinians are not a monolith, Hamas is a deeply fragmented, and there are some major political tendencies and factions within Hamas. And to suggest that we should not engage Hamas is to really suggest that there will be no breakthrough on the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, because you cannot really have a peace settlement, a peace breakthrough without Hamas. And I also would like you to know that Hamas suffered considerably in the eyes of Palestinians as a result of the takeover of Gaza and the subsequent developments by Hamas. Hamas is no longer the pivotal player in Palestinian society. In fact, I returned to Gaza after the takeover of Hamas, and I was really impressed that many Palestinians who used to basically support Hamas are really having second thoughts about Hamas' vision for the Palestinians. Many Palestinians are realizing, even though they support Hamas because it's less corrupt than Fatah, they support Hamas because Hamas is an alternative to the corrupt Fatah and Fatah that really has not delivered the goods. Many Palestinians are questioning the tactics and the ideology and what Hamas has done in Palestinian territories in the last year or so. I want to conclude by saying those fault lines, I stressed the internal development. I didn't really want to focus on American foreign policy because I did not really want you to get the impression that somehow it's all the fault of America. That somehow, as the tendency is, all of us sometimes, academics, we come from a particular background, we believe that the United States has all the cards. But I think I like to believe that the deepening and widening crisis that exists in the Middle East has much to do with American foreign policy, in particular in the last 7 or 8 years. And I want to conclude and put some critical questions on the table for you, and I hope you take me to task for doing that. I think we have the right to imagine, especially in this particular wonderful place, critical minds and open hearts, I think we have the right to imagine if the United States, after 9/11, after that particular murderous development, if the United States, after toppling the Taliban and dispersing Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, basically if the United States had constructed a political vision. A political vision, instead of declaring all-out war against real and imagined enemies, against rogue states, if we constructed a political vision that basically takes into account resolving simmering and regional conflicts in the region, in particular the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Imagine if we had used 9/11, bloody, painful as it was, as a catalyst to really invest serious capital, serious economic and political capital in narrowing divide between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Just for a moment, think what we could have done instead of plunging head-on into Iraq and basically getting bogged down in Iraq's shifting sand. Imagine for a moment, and I think we have the right to imagine, I don't think we are, if the American people, if our leadership, if we had a debate on basically investing the $500 billion that we have spent so far, around $400 billion so far, instead of spending these $400 billion fighting the war in Iraq, if we had invested the $400 billion in trying to engineer, to help, to promote a settlement in the Middle East, not just between the Palestinians and the Israelis, in basically investing in institutional building, in rejuvenating basically failed economic and social and institutions in the region. Imagine for a moment, what kind of the Middle East we would be talking about today. Imagine for a moment, instead of declaring all-out war against Al-Qaeda, I don't need to tell you about Al-Qaeda, bloody and insidious as it is. Al-Qaeda, at the height of its influence in the late 1990s, at the height of its influence, Al-Qaeda never numbered more than 3,000 fighters and militants and terrorists. 3,000 fighters, militants. This is according to all, of course, numbers are very misleading because it takes 19 suicide bombers to do a great deal of damage. But here you have Roma of the 21st century, the United States of America, the greatest economic, political, and military power in the world, declaring all-out war against roving bands of jihadis in the wadis and valleys of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Think of this particular, how the Muslim world views this particular struggle. The United States, Roma of the 21st century, and Osama bin Laden, and Ayman Zawahiri, and Saif al-Adl, and the rest of the lot. We lent legitimacy to those people. I ask people in the Middle East, and I know you know this, there's a war against Al-Qaeda. And people say, against Al-Qaeda, for God's sake, it takes the United States to declare all-out war against the roving bands of jihadis and militants. Think of what our declaration of war against Al-Qaeda has done to Al-Qaeda, has lent legitimacy to Al-Qaeda in the eyes of Muslims, and has also provided Al-Qaeda with ideological ammunition to use against the United States and use against their own governments. Because Al-Qaeda, as you know, I don't want to go into, I've written 2 books on the subject in the last few years. In the late 1990s, the argument, the Islamist ship was sinking. It was sinking in Egypt, it was sinking in Algeria, and the idea was, the debate in the late 1990s, the only way to rescue the sinking Islamist ship is to basically shift the focus from the near enemy meaning Arab and Muslim government, to the far enemy being the United States. And when we shift the focus, when we target the United States would lash out angrily against the Muslim Ummah, and when it does, it would stand up and basically gain credibility in the eyes of the Ummah. The Americans, Ayman Zawahiri wrote in 1999, would fall into our trap. Quote unquote, in a memo to one of his lieutenants in Yemen. And I think, in many ways, I think we have fallen into that trap. And finally, imagine just for a moment, if we, the United States of America, decided to make the promotion of democracy if we believe, if my reading of the situation, if our reading of the situation is that dictators have bled their societies dry, then the promotion of democracy becomes a critical good. Imagine for a moment if we had made the promotion of democracy a genuine plank of American foreign policy. Not in terms of rhetoric, not in the sense of sending our armada, but in the sense of we know what democracy needs. We don't need to be academics. We need institutions, civil society, education. It needs, you have to have the productive base. Imagine for a moment, instead of plunging into the shifting sands of Iraq, if we had invested the 400 billions. I'll take 200 billions. I'll take 100 billions in institutional building. Imagine what kind of Middle East would we be talking about instead of talking about suicide bombings in Iraq. In the last 4 years, by the way, more than 1,000 suicide bombings have been carried out in Iraq. In fact, far from setting a world record in the rapid construction of democracy, what I really would like you to know, Iraq has set a world record in suicide bombings. Take Hamas, Jihad, Hezbollah, and Tamil together in Iraq itself. More than double all the suicide bombings in the world in the last few years. Thank you. I'm sorry to be very depressing and on a sad note, but thank you very much.